The morning sun painted the adobe houses of San Miguel de Allende in shades of gold and pink. This small village, tucked away in the rolling hills of northern Mexico, seemed untouched by the chaos that had been tearing the country apart since 1910. While other towns burned and armies clashed across the nation, life here moved at the same gentle pace it had for generations. About 200 people called this place home. They were simple folk, farmers who worked the land with their bare hands, craftsmen who shaped clay and wood into beautiful things, and shopkeepers who knew every family in the village by name. The streets were dusty and narrow, lined with small houses where 3 generations often lived under one roof. Children ran barefoot between the buildings, their laughter echoing off the walls as they played with sticks and stones. Every morning the men would gather in the small plaza before sunrise. They'd share strong coffee and talk about their crops, the weather, or which of their animals was giving them trouble. Then they'd head out to the fields that stretched beyond the village like a patchwork quilt of green and brown. The women would start their day by fetching water from the old well in the center of town, their colorful dresses bright against the dusty ground. Don Alejandro Mendoza owned most of the land around San Miguel de Allende. His family had controlled these hills and valleys for over a century, back when Mexico was still under Spanish rule. The villagers worked his fields and paid him a portion of their crops each harvest season. In return, he let them live on his land and farm small plots for themselves. Don Alejandro was not a cruel man, at least not compared to other wealthy landowners in Mexico. He didn't force the villagers to work impossible hours or take more than they could afford to give. He lived in a grand hacienda on the hill overlooking the village, with its red tile roof and iron gates, but he rarely bothered the common people with his presence. The arrangement had worked for decades. The villagers understood their place in the world. They were poor, yes, but they had food on their tables and roofs over their heads. Their children learned to read from the village priest, and there was always someone to help when times got tough. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Old Miguel, the village blacksmith, often told stories about the days when his grandfather worked these same fields. "Nothing ever changes here," he would say, hammering red-hot iron on his anvil. "My grandfather planted corn in that field. My father planted corn there, and now my son plants corn there too. That's just how life is." The revolution that had been raging across Mexico for 5 years felt like something happening in another world. Sure, they heard stories from travelers passing through, tales of great battles, of leaders like Francisco, Madero, and Venustiano Carranza fighting for control of the country. Sometimes they even heard whispers about a fierce rebel named Pancho who fought for the rights of poor people. But these stories seemed as distant as fairy tales. What did any of that have to do with their quiet village? They had no army, no weapons, no interest in politics. They just wanted to tend their crops, raise their families, and live in peace. The women would gather at the well each evening to wash clothes and share gossip. They talked about whose daughter might marry whom, about the latest baby born in the village, about whether the rains would come in time for planting season. War and revolution were men's business, happening far away in big cities they'd never seen. Father Rodriguez, the village priest, was one of the few who could read well. Sometimes he would receive newspapers from the capital, weeks old by the time they arrived. He would stand in front of the little church on Sunday mornings and tell his congregation about what was happening in the outside world. But even his news seemed disconnected from their daily lives. "God watches over those who live simply and honestly," Father Rodriguez would say. "We may be poor in money, but we are rich in spirit. As long as we stay true to our faith and take care of each other, the troubles of this world cannot touch." The children of San Miguel de Allende had never known anything but peace. They played the same games their parents had played, learned the same songs, and dreamed simple dreams of growing up to be like their mothers and fathers. Little Ana helped her mother make tortillas each morning. Young Carlos followed his father to the fields and learned how to tell good soil from bad, just by feeling it in his hands. In the evenings, when the work was done, families would sit outside their homes. The men would smoke hand-rolled cigarettes and talk quietly about the next day's tasks. The women would mend clothes or embroider patterns onto fabric. Children would chase fireflies until their mothers called them in for bed. The village had its own rhythm, like a heartbeat that had been steady for generations. Market day brought excitement as people traded goods and caught up on news. Festival days filled the streets with music and dancing. During harvest time, everyone worked together to bring in the crops, sharing the load and celebrating together. When the work was done, Don Alejandro rarely came down from his hacienda, but when he did, people treated him with the respect they thought his position demanded. They would nod politely and step aside to let his horse pass. He seemed content with this arrangement. As long as his fields produced crops and his workers caused no trouble, he left them alone. There were small signs that the outside world was changing, if anyone had bothered to look closely. Government soldiers had been seen on the roads more often lately. Travelers spoke of shortages and rising prices in other towns. Some young men from nearby villages had left to join one army or another, though no one from San Miguel de Allende had been foolish enough to get involved in such dangerous business. The villagers believed their isolation protected them. They were too small to matter, too poor to be worth anyone's attention, too peaceful to be seen as a threat. This belief gave them comfort as they went about their daily lives, planting and harvesting, building and creating, loving and laughing. They had no way of knowing that their peaceful world was built on sand. They couldn't see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, or guess that their trust in Don Alejandro's protection would soon prove to be their greatest mistake. The morning that would change everything started just like any other. The sun rose. Over the hills the roosters crowed, and the people of San Miguel de Allende began another ordinary day in what they believed was their safe, quiet corner of the world. Don Alejandro Mendoza sat in his oak-paneled study, staring at the letter that had arrived 3 days ago. The government seal pressed into the red wax told him this was serious business. Captain Rodriguez of the Federal Army had written with an offer that made the wealthy landowner's hands shake with excitement. The letter was simple and direct. The government would pay 1,000 gold pesos for information about rebel sympathizers. Anyone harboring weapons, spreading revolutionary ideas, or supporting the enemies of the state. The amount was staggering. More money than Don Alejandro, usually made in 6 months from his crops. For decades, Don Alejandro had lived well but not extravagantly. His hacienda was comfortable, his meals were good, and his clothes were fine. But lately things had been getting harder. The revolution had disrupted trade routes. Crops weren't selling for what they used to. His savings had been slowly shrinking, and the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to seemed less secure than before. The landowner walked to his window and looked down at the village below. Those simple adobe houses, the people moving about their daily business like ants in a hill. For years he had seen them as his responsibility, his workers, his tenants. But now, looking at them through the lens of that letter, he saw something else entirely. He saw opportunity. Don Alejandro knew that several men in the village had sons who had left to join various armies. This was common throughout Mexico. Young men seeking adventure, steady pay, or simply escape from the hard life of farming. Some had joined the Federales, others had gone with Villa or Carranza. Most families didn't even know which side their boys were fighting for, if they were still alive at all. But the government didn't need to know these details. They just needed names, locations, and a believable story about rebel activity. The landowner spent 2 days crafting his plan. He knew every family in the village, their histories, their connections. He chose 12 families carefully, not too many to seem unbelievable, not too few to seem insignificant. Families whose sons had left for the revolution. Families who sometimes grumbled about taxes or complained about the hardships of their lives. He wrote their names in careful script. The Gonzalez family, whose eldest son had left 8 months ago and hadn't been heard from since. The Hernandez brothers, both known for their quick tempers and loud voices. Old Pedro, who sometimes spoke critically about the government when he'd had too much to drink. The Morales family, whose teenage boy had talked about becoming a soldier before disappearing one night. Don Alejandro crafted a story that sounded believable. These families, he wrote, had been meeting secretly in the old grain warehouse at the edge of town. They had been stockpiling weapons, old hunting rifles, farm tools that could be used as weapons, even some ammunition they claimed to have stolen from a government patrol. The lie grew more elaborate as he wrote. He described hearing them talk about joining Pancho Villa's army. He claimed they had been spreading revolutionary songs and ideas among the other villagers. He even invented details about plans to attack the local government office in the county seat. None of it was true. The families he named were guilty of nothing more than being poor, being worried about their missing sons, and occasionally complaining about the hardships of their lives. The meetings he described had never happened. The weapons cache existed only in his imagination, but Don Alejandro convinced himself that it could be true. Poor people were naturally drawn to revolution, weren't they? They were probably thinking rebellious thoughts even if they hadn't acted on them yet. By turning them in now, he was probably preventing real trouble later. At least that's what he told himself as he sealed the letter with his own wax and sent it off to Captain Rodriguez. The response came faster than he had expected. Captain Rodriguez was very interested in this rebel nest so close to important supply routes. He would bring a company of soldiers to clean out this problem immediately. Don Alejandro should stay away from the village on the morning they arrived for his own safety. The night before the soldiers came, Don Alejandro couldn't sleep. He paced his study, looking out at the village lights flickering in the darkness below. A few times he almost changed his mind. These were people he had known for years, children he had watched grow up, families who had served his family faithfully for generations. But then he thought about the gold. 1,000 pesos would solve so many of his problems. He could repair his hacienda, buy new equipment, maybe even expand his holdings. The revolution wouldn't last forever, but the improvements he could make with that money would benefit him for years to come. He convinced himself that the soldiers would just arrest the men, maybe question them and let them go when they realized there was no real evidence. How was he supposed to know that Captain Rodriguez had been ordered to make examples of rebels? How could he have predicted that the captain was under pressure from his superiors to show results in the fight against the revolution? The soldiers arrived at dawn, just as the village was waking up. 50 armed men on horseback, their weapons gleaming in the early morning light. They surrounded the village before anyone realized what was happening. Captain Rodriguez had his orders, and Don Alejandro's letter gave him all the justification he needed. These weren't just poor farmers. They were dangerous rebels who threatened the stability of the government. They needed to be dealt with harshly to send a message to other potential troublemakers. The captain's men went from house to house, dragging out the men whose names appeared on Don Alejandro's list. The villagers were confused and terrified. They had no idea why soldiers were pulling their husbands, fathers, and sons from their homes. The women screamed and pleaded, but the soldiers pushed them back with the barrels of their rifles. "Where are the weapons?" Captain Rodriguez demanded of each man as they were dragged to the village square. "Where do you hold your rebel meetings?" Asampo. Men could only stare in confusion. Weapons? Meetings? They had no idea what the captain was talking about. Their bewildered responses only convinced the soldiers that they were dealing with clever rebels who had been trained to deny everything. Don Alejandro watched from his hacienda window as the scene unfolded below. He had expected arrests, maybe, some rough questioning, but as he saw the soldiers lining up the 12 men against the wall of the village church, a cold fear began to settle in his stomach. The first shots echoed across the hills like thunder, then more shots, until the air was filled with the sound of gunfire and the screams of women and children. When the shooting stopped, 12 good men lay dead in the dust of the village square, their blood soaking into the same earth they had worked all their lives. The soldiers searched the village for the weapons cache Don Alejandro had described, but of course found nothing. Captain Rodriguez was annoyed but not surprised. Rebels were clever about hiding their supplies. The important thing was that the message had been sent. As the soldiers rode away, leaving behind a village full of widows and orphans, Don Alejandro sat in his study with his head in his hands. The gold would arrive soon, just as promised. But the price had been higher than he had ever imagined. The men he had condemned were dead, and their blood was on his hands. The village below was silent now, except for the sound of women crying, and children calling for fathers who would never answer again. Don Alejandro had gotten his gold, but he had also created something far more dangerous than the rebel activity he had invented. He had created a thirst for justice that would soon reach the ears of the most feared revolutionary in all of Mexico. Rosa Gonzalez clutched her 4-year-old son Diego close to her chest as she crouched behind the wooden water barrel beside her house. The sound of gunshots had stopped, but the screaming continued. Through a crack in the barrel she could see the village square where her husband Luis had been dragged just minutes before. Luis lay motionless in the dust, his worn work shirt stained with blood. The man she had loved since she was 16, the father of her children, the gentle soul who sang to their baby daughter each night before bed. He was gone forever. The soldiers were searching houses now, looking for weapons that didn't exist and rebels who had never been. Rosa knew she had to run. If they found her, they might decide she was a rebel too. Worse, they might hurt little Diego or take him away. She waited until the soldiers moved to the other end of the village, then slipped out of her hiding place. Diego was crying softly, and she pressed her hand gently over his mouth. "Shh, my baby," she whispered. "We have to be very quiet now." Rosa had grown up in these hills and knew every path, every hiding spot, every cave where children played hide and seek. She made her way carefully through the shadows, moving from house to house, staying low and keeping out of sight. Behind her, she could hear Captain Rodriguez shouting orders. "Burn anything that could be used to hide weapons. These people have been helping rebels. Make sure they understand the price of treason." The smell of smoke began to fill the air as soldiers set fire to the old grain warehouse and several other buildings. Rosa's heart broke as she realized they were destroying the only homes many families had ever known. She reached the edge of the village just as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Looking back one last time, she saw the smoke rising from her homeland and heard the wails of women who had lost everything, but she couldn't stop to help them. She had a more important mission now. For months, Rosa had been hearing stories about Pancho Villa. Travelers passing through the village spoke of him in whispers, some with fear, others with hope. They said he was a bandit who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. They said he was a monster who killed without mercy. They said he was a hero who fought for people like them. Rosa had never paid much attention to these stories before. Politics and war were things that happened far away, to other people. But now, with Luis dead and her village destroyed, she remembered something an old merchant had told her husband just a few weeks ago. "Villa camps near the border," the merchant had said, counting out coins for the corn Luis had sold him. "Maybe 50 miles north, in the canyon country. He takes in anyone who wants to fight for justice. They say he never forgets a wrong done to innocent people." 50 miles. Rosa had never traveled more than 10 miles from her village in her entire life. She had no horse, no money, no food except what she could carry. She had a sick child who needed medicine and rest. But she also had something more, powerful than all of these obstacles. She had rage burning in her heart like a fire that could never be put out. The first day was the hardest. Rosa followed animal trails and dry creek beds, staying away from main roads where soldiers might find her. Diego had a fever and could barely walk, so she carried him most of the way. Her arms ached, her feet were bleeding through her thin shoes, and the sun seemed to burn right through her black dress. By evening, they had covered maybe 8 miles. Rosa found a small cave where they could hide for the night. Diego was getting worse, his little body shaking with chills despite the warm night air. She gave him sips of water from a muddy stream and sang the same lullabies Luis used to sing, trying to keep both of them calm. The second day brought new challenges. The terrain was getting rougher, full of rocks and steep hills that were hard to climb while carrying a child. Rosa's water was running low and she hadn't eaten anything since yesterday morning. But every time she thought about giving up, she remembered the sight of Luis lying in the dust and her feet kept moving. That afternoon, they encountered their first real danger. A group of rough-looking men on horseback spotted them from across a valley. Rosa wasn't sure if they were soldiers, bandits, or just travelers, but she couldn't take any chances. She hid with Diego behind some large rocks until the riders passed. "Mama, I want to go home," Diego whispered, his voice weak and scratchy. Rosa's heart nearly broke. How could she explain to a 4-year-old that they had no home to go back to, that his father was dead and their village was probably still burning? That they were running toward a man who might help them or might kill them on sight? "We're going to find someone who can help us," she told him instead. "Someone who will make the bad men pay for what they did to Papa." The third day tested every bit of strength Rosa had left. They were high in the hills now, in countries she had never seen before. The air was thinner and colder, despite the blazing sun. Diego could no longer walk at all, and carrying him was getting harder with each step. Rosa's feet were covered with blisters and cuts. Her lips were cracked from thirst, and she hadn't eaten anything in 2 days. Several times she stumbled and fell, scraping her knees and hands on the sharp rocks, but she kept getting back up. Late that afternoon, she saw something that made her heart race with hope. Smoke was rising from a hidden valley ahead. Not the black smoke of burning buildings, but the gray smoke of campfires. Lots of them. Rosa forced her tired legs to move faster. As she got closer, she could hear the sounds of men talking, horses whinnying, and metal clanking against metal. This was definitely a military camp, but whose? She crept to the edge of a cliff and looked down into the valley below. What she saw took her breath away. Hundreds of men were camped along a small river. Their horses were picketed in neat rows. Weapons were stacked in organized piles. These weren't bandits or government soldiers. This was a real army. And there, in the center of the camp, she saw a man who could only be Pancho Villa himself. He was shorter than she had expected, but there was something about the way he moved, the way other men stepped aside when he passed, that marked him as their leader. He had the look of someone who had seen too much violence but hadn't let it break his spirit. Rosa knew this was her chance. It might be her only chance. But the climb down into the valley looked dangerous, and Diego was getting weaker by the hour. If she slipped and fell, they would both die. If Villa turned out to be as cruel as some stories claimed, they might die anyway. But what choice did she have? Behind her lay only death and destruction. Ahead lay the only hope for justice she was likely to find. Rosa took a deep breath, adjusted Diego's weight in her arms, and began the treacherous climb down into the valley. With each step, she whispered a prayer to the Virgin of Guadalupe, asking for strength to reach the bottom alive and courage to face whatever waited for her there. The sun was setting by the time Rosa stumbled into the edge of the camp. She was barely conscious, her clothes torn and dusty, her son burning with fever in her arms. Several soldiers saw her coming and raised their weapons, not sure if she was a threat or just another refugee from the violence sweeping Mexico. "Please," Rosa gasped, falling to her knees in the dirt. "I need to speak to Pancho Villa. I have something important to tell him about what happened to my village." One of the soldiers, a young man who couldn't have been much older than 20, knelt down beside her. "What's your name, Senora? Where did you come from?" "Rosa Gonzalez," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "From San Miguel de Allende. They killed my husband. They killed 12 good men for no reason except greed." The soldier's expression changed. He had seen many refugees, but something in this woman's voice told him her story was different. "Wait here," he said. "I'll get the general." Rosa collapsed completely then, her strength finally giving out. But even as darkness closed around her, she held tight to Diego and to the hope that justice might finally be within reach. Francisco Pancho Villa was cleaning his rifle when word came that a woman from San Miguel de Allende was asking to speak with him. The name of the village meant nothing to him at first. There were hundreds of small settlements scattered across northern Mexico, and most had their own troubles with the government forces. But something about the way his scout described the woman caught his attention. She had traveled 50 miles on foot, carrying a sick child, and had nearly died getting to his camp. People didn't make that kind of desperate journey unless something terrible had happened. Villa set down his rifle and walked across the camp to where Rosa lay unconscious near one of the medical tents. His army doctor, an old man named Herrera, who had joined the revolution after government soldiers destroyed his clinic, was examining the fevering boy in her arms. "How are they, doctor?" Villa asked quietly. Dr. Herrera looked up with sad eyes. The child has pneumonia, probably brought on by exposure and exhaustion. The woman is completely drained. No food, no water, no rest for days. But General, there's something else. Look at her hands. Villa knelt down and examined Rosa's hands. They were covered with cuts and calluses, the hands of someone who worked hard for a living. But more than that, they were stained with something dark. Is that blood? Yes, but not hers. She's been handling someone who was badly wounded, probably recently. And look at this. Dr. Herrera pointed to Rosa's dress. The black fabric was torn and dusty from her journey, but Villa could see darker stains on the front, as if someone had died in her arms. Just then, Rosa's eyes fluttered open. She tried to sit up, panicking when she didn't see Diego immediately. Easy, señora, Villa said, in a gentle voice that surprised many people who only knew his reputation as a fierce warrior. Your son is right here. The doctor is taking care of him. Rosa's eyes focused on the man kneeling beside her. Even in her weakened state, she recognized him immediately. Pancho Villa was smaller than the legends made him sound, but his presence filled the space around him like electricity in the air before a storm. His dark eyes seemed to see everything at once, and there was something in his face that told her he had experienced both great kindness and terrible violence. General Villa, she whispered, struggling to form words with her dry throat. I need to tell you what happened to my village, what Don Alejandro did to my husband and the other men. Villa sat cross-legged on the ground beside her, settling in to listen carefully. This wasn't the behavior of a man in a hurry or someone who considered himself too important to hear the troubles of common people. Take your time, señora. Tell me everything. Rosa's voice was weak, but her words were clear. She told him about the peaceful life in San Miguel de Allende, about how the villagers had tried to stay out of the revolution and just live quietly. She described Don Alejandro and how he had always seemed like a reasonable landowner, not cruel, like some others. Then she told him about the morning when the soldiers came, how they dragged 12 innocent men from their homes, how Captain Rodriguez demanded to know about weapons and rebel meetings that had never existed, how the men were shot down like dogs in the village square while their families watched. Villa's expression grew darker with each detail. His hands clenched into fists when Rosa described seeing her husband Luis fall, but he remained silent, letting her tell the whole story. But General, the worst part is why it happened. Rosa continued, her voice growing stronger as anger replaced exhaustion. I heard some of the soldiers talking. They said Don Alejandro had written to Captain Rodriguez telling him we were rebels. He told them we had weapons hidden, that we were planning to join your army. All lies, General. All of it lies so he could collect the reward money the government was offering. Villa's eyes went completely cold. In all his years of fighting, he had seen many kinds of cruelty. He had fought corrupt officials, brutal landowners, and savage soldiers. But there was something particularly disgusting about a man who would betray people who trusted him, who would sell innocent lives for gold. How do you know this for certain? He asked. The soldiers were bragging about it. They said it was the easiest money their captain had ever earned. 1 letter from a landowner and 12 rebels eliminated. They laughed about how surprised the men looked when they realized they were going to die. Villa stood up slowly, his movements controlled but full of contained fury. Around the camp, his men had gathered to listen to Rosa's story. These were hard men, veterans of dozens of battles, but many of them had tears in their eyes as they heard about the massacre at San Miguel de Allende. Colonel Urbina, Villa called to his second-in-command. How many men can you have ready to ride in 1 hour? All of them, General. How many do you need? Villa looked out across his camp, calculating quickly. Don Alejandro's hacienda would be guarded, but probably not heavily. This wasn't a military target, it was a personal matter that required a more focused approach. 150 men, our best riders well armed. We leave as soon as the horses are saddled. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. Villa's army moved with the efficiency of men who had learned that speed often meant the difference. between victory and death. Within 40 minutes, the selected riders were mounted and ready to go. Vila came back to check on Rosa before leaving. Dr. Herrera had given her water and some food, and little Diego's fever was starting to break. "Señora González," Vila said, kneeling beside her again, "I want you to understand something. What happened to your village, what Don Alejandro did to your husband, and those other good men. This kind of betrayal goes against everything I fight, for rich men have been crushing poor people in this country for too long, and it's going to stop." Rosa reached out and grasped his hand with both of hers. "General, I'm not asking you to do this for me. I'm asking you to do it for all the other villages, all the other families who might suffer the same way if men like Don Alejandro think they can get away with selling innocent people's lives." Vila nodded grimly. "Don Alejandro will answer for what he did, I promise you that, but Rosa, may I call you Rosa? I need you to understand that justice isn't always pretty. When we're done with Don Alejandro, there won't be anything left of him to cause more trouble. I understand, General. My Luis was a gentleman who never hurt anyone in his life, but even he would want Don Alejandro to pay for what he did." Vila stood and whistled sharply. His horse, a powerful black stallion named Tornado, trotted over immediately. Vila swung into the saddle with the grace of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than on foot. "Take care of this woman and her boy," he called to Dr. Herrera. "When I come back, I want them both healthy and strong." Then he rode to the head of his column of riders, all of them armed with rifles and pistols, all of them loyal to Vila and his cause of protecting the common people of Mexico. "Men," Vila called out, his voice carrying clearly across the valley, "we ride to San Miguel de Allende, where a rich coward named Don Alejandro sold the lives of 12 innocent men for government gold. We're going to show him what happens when someone betrays the people we're sworn to protect." A cheer went up from the riders, but it wasn't the wild shout of men eager for battle. It was grimmer than that, the sound of men who understood they were riding to deliver justice, not just to fight. Vila spurred his horse forward, and the column followed him out of the valley and into the hills. They rode hard through the night, covering ground at a pace that would have killed lesser horses and weaker men. Vila had been riding these hills for years, and he knew every trail, every shortcut, every place where they could rest their horses without being seen. As dawn broke over the mountains, Vila's riders crested the last hill before San Miguel de Allende. The village below looked peaceful in the early morning light, but Vila could see the smoke-blackened ruins of buildings that had been burned by the soldiers. In the distance, Don Alejandro's hacienda sat on its hill like a fortress, its red tile roof gleaming in the sunrise. Vila raised his hand and his men stopped behind him. For a moment, they sat silently on their horses, looking down at the scene of tragedy below. "Remember," Vila said quietly, "the villagers are not our enemies. Don Alejandro is the one who betrayed them. We're here to make sure he never betrays anyone again." Then he spurred his horse down the hill, and 150 armed riders followed him toward the hacienda where Don Alejandro was about to learn that some betrayals carry a price that must be paid in full. Don Alejandro had not slept well since the massacre 3 days ago. The gold coins were locked in his safe, 1,000 pesos, more money than he had seen in years. But they brought him no peace. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the men who had died in the village square. He was pacing his study at dawn when he heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching his hacienda. Looking out his window, Don Alejandro's blood turned to ice. A massive column of armed riders was surrounding his estate, their weapons glinting in the morning sun. These weren't government soldiers. Their clothes were mixed. Some wore parts of military uniforms, others dressed like cowboys or farmers. But they all carried rifles and pistols, and they moved with the discipline of experienced fighters. In the center of the group, Don Alejandro could see a man on a black horse whose very presence seemed to command respect from all the others. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking that figure. Pancho Vila had come to San Miguel de Allende. Don Alejandro's servants had already fled at the first sight of the riders. The hacienda's few guards, old men with ancient rifles who were more for show than protection, had thrown down their weapons and run for the hills. Don Alejandro was completely alone. Villa dismounted and walked straight to the front door of the hacienda. He didn't bother to knock. With one powerful kick, he sent the heavy wooden door crashing open, splintering the ornate frame that Don Alejandro's grandfather had carved by hand. The landowner was waiting in his study, trying to appear calm and dignified despite the terror in his eyes. He had put on his finest suit and arranged himself behind his massive desk, as if conducting normal business. "Señor Villa," Don Alejandro said, his voice shaking only slightly. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Villa walked slowly around the room, taking in the expensive furniture, the paintings on the walls, the shelves full of books that Don Alejandro had probably never read. Everything in this room spoke of wealth and privilege built on the backs of poor people. "I think you know exactly why I'm here, Don Alejandro," Villa said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was something in it that made the landowner's hands tremble. "A woman named Rosa Gonzalez walked 50 miles through the desert to find me. She had quite a story to tell about what happened here 3 days ago." Don Alejandro's face went pale. "I don't know what lies this woman has been telling you, but..." "Lies?" Villa's voice cut through Don Alejandro's words like a knife. "Are you saying that 12 men weren't shot down in cold blood in your village square? Are you saying that Captain Rodriguez didn't come here with his soldiers based on information someone provided about supposed rebels?" The landowner opened his mouth to deny everything, but the words wouldn't come. Villa's dark eyes seemed to see straight through him, as if they could read the guilt written on his soul. "You see, Don Alejandro, I've been fighting this revolution for 6 years now. I've learned to recognize different kinds of men. There are brave men and coward men. There are honest men and liars. There are men who protect their people and men who sell them out for gold." Villa picked up an expensive crystal paperweight from the desk and examined it casually. "Which kind of man do you think you are?" "Señor Villa, please, you must understand," Don Alejandro began, but Villa held up a hand to silence him. "I understand perfectly. You needed money and the government was offering rewards for information about rebels. So you invented some rebels. You chose 12 families from your village, good people who trusted you, who worked your land and paid their tribute faithfully. And you sold their lives for 1,000 pesos. Villa set the paperweight down with a sharp click. "The question is, what should I do with a man who commits such a betrayal?" Don Alejandro fell to his knees behind his desk, his dignity completely abandoned now. "Please, General Villa, I can make this right. I can pay you more than the government paid me. I can give you information about real government positions, troop movements. You can make it right?" Villa's voice rose for the first time, filled with genuine anger. "Can you bring back Luis Gonzalez? Can you bring back the 11 other men who died because of your lies? Can you give Rosa her husband back or those children their fathers?" The landowner had no answer. He knelt there shaking, tears running down his face, knowing that there was nothing he could say that would save him. Villa walked to the window and looked down at the village below. Many of the people had come out of their houses now, watching the hacienda to see what would happen. Some were the widows of the murdered men. Others were families who had lost their homes when the soldiers burned their buildings. "Bring him," Villa commanded. 2 of Villa's men entered the study and hauled Don Alejandro to his feet. They marched him outside and down the hill to the village square, the same square where 12 innocent men had died 3 days before. The bloodstains were still visible in the dust. The villagers gathered around, their faces showing a mixture of hope, fear, and desperate desire for justice. Villa stood in the center of the square and gestured for quiet. "People of San Miguel de Allende," he called out, his voice carrying to every corner of the plaza. "I am Francisco Villa. I fight for the rights of working people, for the poor against the rich, for justice against oppression." He pointed at Don Alejandro, who was barely able to stand between the 2 revolutionaries holding him upright. "This man betrayed you. He wrote lies to the government soldiers, claiming that your husbands and fathers were rebels. He sold their lives for gold. 1,000 pesos, the price he put on 12 good men." A murmur went through the crowd, anger mixing with grief. Some of the women began to cry again, remembering their losses. Others clenched their fists, wanting revenge. "Don Alejandro," Villa continued, Tell these people what you did. Tell them why their loved ones died. The landowner could barely speak through his sobs. I needed the money. The government offered rewards for information about rebels. I thought they would just arrest them, question them, maybe put them in jail for a while. I never thought. You never thought they would be murdered? Villa's voice was cold as winter wind. You never considered that selling innocent people to government soldiers might result in their deaths? Or did you just not care, as long as you got your gold? Don Alejandro had no answer that wouldn't condemn him further. Villa turned to address the crowd again. Justice demands that crimes be punished, especially crimes against innocent people. But justice also demands that the people who suffered most should have a say in how that punishment is carried out. He gestured toward Rosa, who had just arrived from Villa's camp. Dr. Herrera had pronounced her and Diego well enough to travel, and Villa had brought them back to see justice done. Rosa Gonzalez lost her husband Luis because of this man's greed. She walked 50 miles through dangerous country to ask for justice. Rosa, what do you think should happen to Don Alejandro? Rosa stepped forward, her small son Diego clinging to her skirt. She looked at Don Alejandro for a long moment, this man who had seemed so powerful just a week ago, now reduced to a sobbing coward. General Villa, she said in a clear, strong voice. My Luis was a good man who never hurt anyone. He worked hard. He loved his family. He tried to live an honest life. Don Alejandro took that away from him, and from 11 other good men, for no reason except his own selfishness. She paused, looking around at the faces of her neighbors, seeing the pain in their eyes. I don't want revenge, General. I want justice. I want to make sure that no other village, no other families, ever suffer the way we have suffered. I want Don Alejandro to understand the full weight of what he has done. Villa nodded solemnly. Then justice will be done, but it will be complete justice. What happened next became legend throughout northern Mexico. Villa didn't simply execute Don Alejandro, though many expected him to. Instead, he forced the landowner to face the full consequences of his actions. First, Don Alejandro was made to dig 12 graves in the village cemetery with his own hands, one for each man who had died because of his lies. The work took him all day, and by the end his soft hands were bloody and raw. Then Villa opened Don Alejandro's safe and distributed not just the blood money he had received, but all of his wealth among the families of the village. The land deeds that had kept the people as tenants for generations were burned in a ceremony in the village square. From this day forward, Villa announced, this land belongs to the people who work it. No single man will ever again hold power over your lives and deaths. Don Alejandro's final punishment was exile. Villa's men escorted him to the edge of the village with nothing but the clothes on his back. He was warned that if he ever returned to the region, or if he ever again betrayed innocent people to the authorities, Villa would hear about it and the punishment would be swift and final. Villa left a small garrison of his men in San Miguel de Allende to protect the village from future government raids. He also helped the people establish a council to govern themselves, chosen from among the most respected families. Before leaving, Villa visited Rosa one last time. Little Diego was playing with other children in the square, already beginning to recover from the trauma of losing his father.